Vodacom has released a statement to shareholders today indicating that it has reached an out-of-court settlement in the Please Call Me matter with Nkosana Makate. Vodacom says its board approved a settlement agreement and that it has been accounted for in the group's interim results for the 6-month period ended 30 September 2025, which are set to be released later this month. It says, as part of the settlement process, a notice was sent to the Supreme Court of Appeal withdrawing Vodacom's appeal, while a notice was sent to the High Court to abandon the 8 February 2022 judgment in the matter. The agreed figure was not made public. Let's unpack this now with SABC News Economics Editor Tshepo Mongoai. Tshepo, good evening. This is a historic moment. This case is more than a decade old, in fact, and its first appearance in the Constitutional Court is as far back as 2016, when the court held there that Vodacom indeed must pay Nkosana Makate. But important to note here is that this was subject to board approval, and it's not like any other contingent liability that the CEO would just approve that would fall on that contingent liability book. It is a settlement that the board had to consider, which would give the impression that it is sensitive and potentially a large number. Given what the Constitutional Court had found earlier in terms of what the scale of payment must be, where do you think the settlement may have fallen around?
Well, we know that Makate actually said that it must be, he wanted anything between 28 billion to around 110 billion. And 110 billion is just very close to the revenue of Vodacom, which is estimated at about 115 billion rand. So you see the scale of this is quite sizable, but I do not think that what Makate is going to be receiving, it's anywhere close to that, but it must be quite sizable. You recall, Oliver, that he's been, of course, using a legal team, and I'm sure that was done on a pro bono basis. And the initial lawyer that he had used actually abandoned him because that lawyer wanted him to accept the settlement, and then he was not willing to do that. And I think over time he worked with a different legal team. I suspect that they also had a sway in him accepting what was on the table, because once you are dealing with this huge legal team, you're probably raking up a lot of legal costs over time, and over those years the bill must be very, very high, and I'm sure it's going to take a sizable portion of that particular settlement. Obviously, over time, this thing must really come to an end. It cannot go on forever. Yeah. So there was definitely some sway from his legal team that he accepted the offer.
Vodacom has an estimated market capitalization of 290 billion rand. In fact, last year it had reported a net profit, EBITDA net profit of 16.6 billion. One would assume that if Makate were to get, let's say, a conservative figure like at least R1 billion, which of course would be subject to board approval, that it would not all come in the form of cash. Some of it, I would assume, would likely come in equity and or debt. Has Makate in the past shown any sort of appetite for a settlement that is a combination of those instruments, cash, debt, as well as equity?
Well, it will depend what is in need of. If obviously he needs to settle some of the bills that I have no doubt they are quite sizable, he will need cash. Vodacom is actually a formidable company with a huge market share, with paying a very good dividend. So it would not be actually a bad offer if he accepts some of the settlement in shares, because it is actually a liquid company. He can easily cash those shares. So it will all depend on the negotiations that have happened. We will know over time, as it is a public company, So those numbers will have to be disclosed over a period of time. But what was quite also interesting for me is that I looked at the share price immediately, and they had not reacted to the news. And I think partly is because we don't know the significance and how big is the settlement. And I think perhaps by the time we know this, and as there is a provision for it, I also doubt if it will have any significant impact on the share price.
Yeah, Vodacom doesn't have a lot of cash on hand to give Makate, right? The cash would have to come somewhere else. And there were questions around whether other innovative instruments could be used to offset some of the liability that would come from this. The PIC, which is one of the largest shareholders of Vodacom, invests money on behalf of the government employee pension fund. What would have been the possibility that, as a shareholder, the PIC would have wanted to protect itself from shareholder dilution in this Makate matter and would have offered Makate a share in any of the other listed entity or what is on the books of the listed entities at the PIC to be able to say, look, let's protect the share price of Vodacom and look at these other options?
Well, it's likely that they could go to the market and get the money and pay Makate as they do all the time. They tap into the market. They've got instruments to raise that money. If indeed Makate insists that he wants that money, I mean, and I think for a company like Vodacom, they will not settle to find that money in the market. They are a listed company. They could also sell some of their shares without actually diluting some of the shareholders. So it's a big company. They have a lot of options to consider that they can to raise this money. The issue is how does it change their fortune? Does it end up with a very huge debt that they have to pay, that is sacrifice some of the projects that they were going to fund, and they have to temporarily hold those projects? I think that's where it will really start to have a very negative impact, that investors may look at it slightly different after this particular incident and settlement.
Yeah. Tshepo Mongoai, thank you so much for that. Really do appreciate it. SABC News Economics Editor talking to us there on the Makate and Vodacom matter.